Story 1. Took my seat? Take this.
Scene: Greyhound bus ride from Seattle to Spokane. What happened? Halfway through we stopped for a scheduled meal stop. People getting off left their jackets, books, etc. where they sat. When I reboard, I found a fat schlub sitting in my seat. He has removed my items and placed them somewhere else. This was totally unnecessary as there were plenty of other empty seats. He would not budge. The revenge: he was avidly reading a paperback book. We made a rest stop further down the line. When he got off, I went to his seat and removed the last 30 pages from the book and placed it back down.
Comment 1. Nice to meet you, Satan. Big fan of your work. Comment 2. Scorched Earth revenge if you're an avid reader, lol. Comment 3. I physically recoiled reading what you did. Well done. Comment 4. This is one of the best, pettiest revenges I've seen on this sub. I salute you. Comment 5. As an avid reader, I don't care how evil people will say that is. That's some funny dollar hit right there. When the trip was over, as you're walking past, you should have said, I hear the ending is fantastic, with a wink.
Comment 6. Savage. Although I think I would have reclaimed my seat and ripped out the pages.
Story 2. A lawyer's petty revenge on his grade 9 English teacher.
The revenge I took on my grade 9 English teacher was so petty that I hesitate to write about it. But Mrs. Bristle, for that is the name I will give her, was cruel to me every chance she got, and she made my first year in high school a misery. So when a file with her name on it arrived at my office, my first thought was not that I would beat her, for I was certain that I would, but rather, of the revenge I would take along the way. I was pushing 40 when Mrs. Bristle's file hit my desk, some estate litigation where a mother's last will and testament left my clients next to nothing, and gave their sister, Mrs. Bristle, pretty well the entire estate. When I saw the defendant's name, it looked familiar, and after a bit of Googling, I confirmed what I suspected: the defendant, Mrs. Bristle, was my former grade 9 English teacher. I remembered Mrs. Bristle very well. She was supposed to be teaching us the wonders of English literature, but what she really taught us were her rules, by which she meant her arbitrary whims, expressed in vague language, backed up by petty punishments for non-compliance. There was an art to getting along with Mrs. Bristle, and while most of the other kids learned it easily enough, somehow I did not. I have trouble learning unwritten rules, and in Mrs. Bristle's class, where unwritten and constantly changing rules were the order of the day, I didn't stand a chance. Mrs. Bristle admonished me almost daily for not paying attention. I did detentions, rewrote assignments, and made visits to the principal's office, all because I apparently wasn't listening, wasn't doing what I was told. Many was the time when Mrs. Bristle took me to task for missing some obvious but unstated part of an assignment. One time I handed in a sonnet and received an F because the rhyming pattern was Petrarchan, not Shakespearean. But she would be nice to me, Mrs. Bristle would always say when she tossed my work back at me. She would give me another chance to hand the assignment in with the arbitrary changes she required, in the end giving me a good mark, but then heavily downgraded for being late. Mrs. Bristle's case worked its way through the early stages, and every time I exchanged an email with her, for she was a self-rep, no need for counsel, she claimed, I thought about the unpleasant time I'd spent in her class. I had a rough time in high school, and I always resent anything that makes me dwell on it. After a few months, the case was ready for the next stage. It was time to examine Mrs. Bristle, to find out why she thought her mother wanted to disinherit most of the family and enrich Mrs. Bristle alone. I showed up at the court reporter's office early as usual, to get set up. "What's that crap-eating grin on your face?" Adam asked. He was a lawyer colleague, about my vintage, and we were sitting in the lounge for lawyers only, the room that most court reporters' offices have, a place for the lawyers to hang out and shoot the crap, no clients allowed. "I'm going to examine my grade 9 English teacher today," I said, "and it's going to be fun." I explained how Shed hated me back in the day, and had done her best to make my life hell. "What's the case about?" Adam said. Adam had been around the block, same as me, and it took only a few words for me to summarize everything that mattered in the file. Estate fight, 1 sibling against 4, undue influence, holograph will cutting out most of the siblings, competing with an older will, a formal one, where the shares are equal. Adam nodded appreciatively. Nice fees, if the estates got the cash. It does, I said. We chatted for a bit, and then sat there in silence as we each did the last bit of prep for the cases we had that day, making notes, reading documents, and drinking coffee. My alarm dinged just before 10, and I made my way to the examination room, and Mrs. Bristle, the teacher, had greatly disliked the grade 9 version of Called in the 90s. I was curious to see if she would like the older version any better. ////. The examination started, and Mrs. Bristle and I sparred for a while, me tossing vague questions her way, and criticizing her when she did not understand. I kept her on the defensive for close to 3 hours, until it was getting on to 1 p.m. Aren't you in a conflict or something? She said to me just before the lunch break, when Shed finally made the connection, and understood that the lawyer asking her questions was a former student. No conflict, I said, dismissing her concerns with a wave of my hand. During the lunch break, there's something I need you to do. I don't want to answer questions during lunch. I need a break. The examination had been rough on Mrs. Bristle. She was not used to being asked questions, to being held to account, to being constantly challenged, and even having her grammar corrected now and again. You'll get your lunch break. But while you're eating a sandwich or whatever, keep this copy of the holograph will next to you. The will on which Mrs. Bristle's case relied was a holograph will, meaning that Mrs. Bristle's mother had written the will entirely in hand from start to finish. The mother, or more likely Mrs. Bristle herself, had downloaded a holograph will form from the web, and had completed it in accordance with the website's instructions. Holograph wills are special. You can do a holograph will without a witness, without a lawyer, without anything at all, so long as you did it right. But if you got anything wrong, if you messed up in any way, it was invalid. You want me to read the will again over lunch? Mrs. Bristle said. No. Instead, I want you to make a handwritten copy of it. You want me to write it out? Whatever for. There's an allegation that the will wasn't written by your mother, and that you wrote it up instead. An allegation that I'd made up myself, that morning, while I was sitting in the lawyer's lounge, drinking coffee and munching on a muffin. My clients had not challenged the will's handwriting, it was obviously their mother's, totally different from Mrs. Bristle's own writing. But I had decided otherwise. Mrs. Bristle was appropriately outraged at being unjustly accused of forgery. Said she could prove it wasn't her handwriting, could absolutely prove it. Then let's settle the forgery issue once and for all, I said, write out the will in your own hand, so that our document experts can examine it, compare it with the original, and make a determination. I don't need the entire lunch break for that, Mrs. Bristle said, and I'd rather eat lunch at the restaurant downstairs. The will was barely a page long, at most 300 words, that being all it took for the mother to allegedly disinherit most of her children, and inexplicably leave everything to Mrs. Bristle. The mother had written up the will herself, but she'd been 90 at the time, while living in Mrs. Bristle's house, and very much under her influence. I've retained 5 different experts, I said, and each of them will need copies. 5 experts? Why so many experts? Each expert needs 10 samples, for comparison purposes. It's going to take you a while, Mrs. Bristle. I suggest you get started. I overrode her protests, and once she started to write, I left her in the room, and went to the lawyer's lounge to eat their small sandwiches and drink more of the excellent coffee. After a while I stopped by the examination room to look in on Mrs. Bristle. I wanted to check in on her progress. Mrs. Bristle asked for more time, complained of writer's cramp, and asked me again if it was really necessary for her to write out the holograph will 50 times in her own hand, and I assured her that there was nothing for it, that it was absolutely necessary. I returned to the lounge to check my emails, leaving her hard at the homework I'd given her. After a while my colleague, Adam, popped into the lounge. He asked me how it was going, the examination with the teacher who had treated me so badly. In making her write lines. Adam laughed, and laughed harder when I explained that I wasn't kidding, that I really was making Mrs. Bristle write lines, and how I was doing it. His laughter attracted attention, and a few other lawyers asked what was up. "He's making his teacher witness write lines," Adam said, and the lawyers' lounge hooted with laughter when I told everyone what was up. It was one of the pettiest things I've ever done to anyone, making my grade 9 teacher write lines. But the writing lines thing was just a warm-up. The real revenge had yet to come. I returned to the examination room after a while, to check up on Mrs. Bristle, see how she was doing. "This is taking forever," she said, "and I really don't get why you need it." She had writer's cramp, and was shaking her hand to get the kinks out. I picked up the stack of holograph wills she'd created, and flipped through it. She was nowhere near finished. On second thought, I said, "Maybe it isn't necessary." "I think you're right. I don't need any handwriting samples from you." "Why not?" she said. "The will is invalid," I explained, adding that because her mother had used a pre-printed form off the web, the law would not recognize the will. "A holograph will has to be entirely in the testator's handwriting," I explained, every single word entirely in handwriting from start to finish. "This will doesn't qualify, because your mother used a standard form, a form printed off the web, with instructions and boxes and questions and so on, and when you do that, then the will is no longer a holograph will. It's a regular will, and regular wills need to be properly witnessed. This one isn't witnessed, and that means it's not a will. It's just a piece of paper." "Are you trying to tell me that you only figured that out now? What kind of lawyer are you, anyways?" "What kind of lawyer am I?" "I'm a lawyer who makes a witness skip lunch, and sit in a small room all alone, and write lines. Sound familiar, Mrs. Bristle?" She said nothing, and just stared at me. I closed the door on her, leaving her alone once more, and left for the Middle Temple Tavern where the lawyers all hung out. It was time to hoist a Guinness and enjoy my petty triumph.
Comment 1. I think we've all had a Mrs. Bristle we'd like to get revenge on. Yours was exceptional. Comment 2. This is absolutely outstanding. Comment 3. Perfect revenge on a bad teacher that could have ruined school for you. Good on you for continuing your education and not letting her win in both cases.
Comment 4. While not a lawyer myself, everyone in my family is: my parents, my siblings, my spouse, and my spouse's parents. I have forwarded your story to all of them.
Comment 5. This is the best petty revenge post I've read. I hope Ms. Bristle didn't get the lion's share of the will, and I hope her cramps turn into carpal tunnel. Comment 6. Petty revenge best served as handwritten copies.
Story 3. Pretty sure you killed my dogs. This isn't equal, but it's something.
When I was 17, my family had 2 rescue dogs. One was a German Shepherd the family gave up because she was too wild. She'd datery things in the house like couches and shoes, whatever was left around her unattended. The final straw for the family was when she nipped one of their kids. We took her home with us, and when we got home my dad and I sat out on front porch with her. We lived in the country. Dad told me to take her collar off and let her go free. I did. She ran around for hours until she tired herself from chasing chickens. Then she came back and sat beside me. From that moment on, she was the most behaved and intelligent dog I'd ever known. She'd listen to all commands and was just an incredible dog. A year or 2 later we adopted another dog. A male Rottweiler. He had been locked in a room in a suburban home, was too vicious and had serious issues. If you pet him and stopped before he was satiated, he'd growl and sometimes attack. He was pretty aggressive, but the rescue shepherd would hang with him and bring him toys when he'd get put in a kennel when he was acting out. We had a driveway between our property and the other property to the north. The man who lived there had 2 daughters. He'd force his daughter to cut grass all summer and tend to his prized rose garden. Sometimes our Rottweiler would watch the girls. But he'd never crossed the too high fences because it was pretty impossible as they were solid barriers that were well maintained. The man next door said we had to put the Rottweiler down, that he looked crazy. He had multiple conversations with my dad and Dad would say we are rehabbing him. He'll never be able to cross those two fences. It's impossible. The man's retort? Well, if they get bit, I'll sue you for everything you own. Dad said, well then that works out for you then. You'll be rich. Months later I came home late night and my shepherd was acting funny. It was like she was drunk. Wobbly, stumbling. I took her to the vet and they asked if we had any antifreeze on the property. I said yes, we are a farm, but we keep all our chemicals locked up because we know dogs get into anything. They asked about rat poison. I said the same thing. The vet told me that she'd been poisoned and they'd try to help. Unfortunately, she ended up dying. I was a wreck. Our Rottweiler, though he wasn't poisoned, would no longer eat after the shepherd died. They were friends, probably his only true friend, and I am sure he died of depression. I was convinced it was my neighbor. 17 years we'd lived on that farm and my father was very diligent about poison control on the property. The way the girls acted around me changed and it made it certain for me that their father must have chucked a poisoned piece of meat into our yard. A half a year or so later the man and his family moved a few miles away. Me and the girls went to HS together so I knew where they lived because there was only one school bus that serviced the kids in my rural area. One night after driving home a little tipsy, I know, I was a dumb kid, I decided to take revenge. I'd been hearing on the bus about how her dad was making maple syrup now on their new property. I could see the sap buckets hanging from the maple trees. On this tipsy night, imagining if things were different and my dog hadn't died, she'd probably be coming to the gate to meet me. I couldn't take it so I pulled over and crept onto their property with my full bladder and pissed in as many sap buckets as I could. Just a tinkle here and there, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to hit 90% of the sap buckets. I freaking hope they talk about that year when the maple syrup had a salted caramel flavor to it and how they were never able to replicate it. Frick you, Terry.
Comment 1. Good for you. If you and they still live there, you should be making it an annual tradition.
Comment 2. I would have done something a little more equal to those sap buckets, but I'm a bit reckless.
Comment 3. Sorry about your dog. Comment 4. I had an neighbor who was a thief and bully poisoned my beloved collie Cross because he had beef with my brother, but was too much of a coward to face him. I was 16 and laid next to that sweet boy as he took his last painful breath. The was in and out of jail, and apparently after robbing some old lady for a second time he got caught and died of an OD in prison. Safe to say there were no tears shed on his behalf in my household. I can neither confirm nor deny saying good riddance to bad rubbish.
Comment 5. I would have dumped something on all of his roses that would have not only killed them, but made the soil unusable for years to come.
Comment 6. Let's all piss in Terry's syrup. The Boston Piss Party.